Go to almost any major city on earth, from São Paulo to Lagos, from Seoul to right here in the United States, and you will find them. Massive churches, seating thousands, filled with some of the most vibrant, energetic, and fastest growing congregations in the world. You'll hear ecstatic music, you'll see hands raised in praise, and you will hear a sound that is both ancient and modern, the sound of believers speaking in tongues. This is Pentecostalism, with its emphasis on a direct, personal experience of God, miraculous healing, and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. It is arguably the most dynamic and explosive force in modern Christianity. With an estimated 600 million followers worldwide, it's a global phenomenon. And what if I told you that this entire global movement, this spiritual earthquake that has reshaped the face of modern religion, can be traced back to one specific place, at one specific time? Not to a grand cathedral in Rome, or a theological university in Germany, but to a humble, dilapidated, former stable in a dusty industrial neighborhood of Los Angeles, in the year 1906. And it was all led by a man most of history has tried to forget, the humble, one-eyed son of formerly enslaved parents. Today, we tell the incredible, improbable, and revolutionary story of the Azusa Street Revival, the Big Bang of modern Pentecostalism, and one of the most significant and forgotten events in American religious history. To understand the explosion that happened at Azusa Street, you first have to understand the religious kindling that was lying around in late 19th century America. In the decades after the Civil War, a powerful movement known as the Holiness Movement had been growing out of Methodism. These were Christians who were hungry for more. They believed that the standard Christian life of conversion and church attendance wasn't enough. They were seeking a deeper, more profound experience of God. They taught that after a person was saved, there was a second blessing available to them, an experience of entire sanctification, a crisis moment that would purify their heart and make them holy. This created a theological environment where people were actively seeking powerful, personal, post-conversion experiences with the divine. Into this world stepped a controversial holiness preacher from Kansas named Charles Parham. Parham took the holiness movement's ideas and added a radical, new, and explosive ingredient. He proposed that there was a third blessing. After salvation and after sanctification, there was the ultimate experience, the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And, Parham argued, this third experience had a specific, required sign. The initial, physical evidence that you had been baptized in the Holy Spirit was that you would speak in other tongues, just as the apostles had on the day of Pentecost in the biblical book of Acts. This was his unique and highly controversial contribution. For Parham, speaking in tongues was not just one possible gift of the Spirit, it was the sign, the necessary proof, and it was this specific, explosive idea that would be carried to Los Angeles by his most unlikely student. His name was William J. Seymour, and his story is one of the most powerful and overlooked in American history. Seymour was born in Louisiana in 1870, the son of two people who had been born into slavery. He grew up in the suffocating poverty and brutal racism of the Jim Crow South. He was a humble, deeply pious man, self-educated and blind in his left eye from a bout of smallpox. In the early 1900s, Seymour, now a traveling holiness preacher himself, heard about Charles Parham's new theology. He traveled to Houston, Texas, in 1905 to attend Parham's Bible school. But because of the strict segregation laws of the time, Seymour, a black man, was not allowed in the classroom with the white students. He had to sit in the hallway with the door left slightly ajar so he could listen to Parham's lectures. Imagine that. The man who would become the leader of a global movement had to learn its founding theology from a hallway like an eavesdropper. But Seymour absorbed the ideas. He became convinced that the baptism of the Holy Spirit, with the evidence of speaking in tongues, was the experience that the modern church was missing. And in 1906, he received an invitation to preach at a small Black holiness church in Los Angeles. He accepted the call, carrying Parham's theological fire with him to the West Coast. When Seymour arrived in Los Angeles, his new message was not well received. On his very first Sunday preaching, he laid out Parham's doctrine that speaking in tongues was the necessary evidence of the Holy Spirit's baptism. The church elders were appalled. This was too radical. They kicked him out and padlocked the church doors on him. Now homeless and rejected, Seymour was taken in by a family on North Bonnie Bray Street. He began holding prayer meetings on their front porch. A small group of African-American believers, hungry for revival, gathered with him. They would pray, fast, and sing for hours, asking God to send down the Holy Spirit as he had in the book of Acts. Then, on the evening of April 9th, 1906, it happened. After hours of prayer, a man named Edward Lee, a friend of Seymour's, suddenly fell to the floor and began speaking in what his companions believed were other tongues. The fire, as they called it, had fallen. The news spread like wildfire through the city's holiness communities. The crowds grew so large that the front porch of the small house collapsed under their weight. They knew they needed a bigger building. They found one downtown at 312 Azusa Street. It was a complete wreck. It was a former African Methodist Episcopal AIM church. But it was now a dilapidated 40 by 60 foot wooden building that had been recently used as a stable and a lumber yard. The atmosphere was humble, with planks set on wooden barrels for pews and a simple wooden box for a pulpit. But what happened inside this humble building was a spiritual explosion. From 1906 to 1909, the Azusa Street revival was a non-stop phenomenon. Services were held 3 times a day, 7 days a week, often lasting late into the night. The worship was spontaneous and ecstatic. There was no order of service, no hymnals. People would sing, pray, preach, and testify as they felt led by the Spirit. The central event was the tarrying people kneeling at simple altars, praying for hours until they received the baptism of the Holy Spirit and spoke in tongues. But the most revolutionary aspect of Azusa Street was its radical racial and social equality. At the absolute height of the brutal Jim Crow era in America, a time of lynchings and horrific segregation, the Azusa Street revival was shockingly integrated. Black people, white people, Latinos, Asians, rich, poor, men and women all worshipped together, and the undisputed leader, the pastor who set the tone and guided the services, was the one-eyed black son of former slaves, William J. Seymour. Women were not just allowed to participate, they preached, prophesied, and were central leaders in the movement. The secular press was horrified. The Los Angeles Times mocked them as a weird babel of tongues and wrote with disgust about the disgusting intermingling of the races. The revival itself eventually cooled down around 1909, and the movement that it birthed began to institutionalize and, tragically, to fracture. The beautiful, radical racial unity that was the hallmark of Azusa Street did not last. Within a decade, white leaders in the new Pentecostal movement began to pull away, uncomfortable with black leadership. They started their own segregated denominations, most famously the Assemblies of God. which formed in 1914 in Hot Springs, Arkansas. The movement, born in a moment of racial unity, tragically succumbed to the racism of American society. But the seeds planted at Azusa Street could not be contained. Believers who had come from all over the country and the world to witness the revival in person took the Pentecostal fire back to their communities. The revival published its own newspaper, The Apostolic Faith, which Seymour sent out for free to tens of thousands of people across the globe, spreading the news and the theology. The Pentecostal message, with its emphasis on supernatural power, direct experience, and community, found incredibly fertile ground, especially in the global South. The missionaries and believers who were touched by Azusa Street took its message to South America, to Africa, and to Asia, and it exploded today. The vast majority of Pentecostals are not white Americans. They are Brazilians, Nigerians, Koreans, and Filipinos. The small, integrated prayer meeting in a Los Angeles stable truly became the big bang for a global religious movement that now numbers in the hundreds of millions. So, the story of Azusa Street is the story of an incredible and improbable legacy. A global faith born in a moment of radical equality, led by one of the most marginalized figures imaginable in early 20th century America. And this history leaves us with a profound and deeply debatable question. How should we understand this event? Was the Azusa Street revival a genuine, supernatural miracle, direct, divine intervention by the Holy Spirit, a modern-day repeat of the biblical day of Pentecost? Or was it a powerful sociological phenomenon, the predictable, yet explosive, result of a desperate and marginalized community, poor people, people of color, women, the uneducated, finding a new, ecstatic, and empowering form of religious expression that gave them a voice, a sense of direct divine purpose, and an equality they were denied in the outside world? Is this a story about the supernatural power of God, or the incredible power of the human spirit to create meaning and hope in the face of oppression? Or is it impossible to separate the two? Let me know your thoughts, respectfully, in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into a forgotten chapter of American history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers the real stories behind our modern world. Thanks for watching.